This podcast is designed for the purpose of entertainment and information and is not meant to be considered medical advice.
What? It's not?
No.
Are you sure?
Yeah, our lawyer said we can't do that anymore.
Aw.
It's a show about medicine.
Please wear a mask while listening.
The guy you just heard is Dr. Christopher Labos.
And the other guy is Jonathan Jarry. I'm a doctor, but he's not.
Sorry that I did biomedical research instead. Jeez.
And we're gonna look at the evidence behind medical topics. And the show is
Wait. No, I want to say it.
No, I want to say it.
I want to say it. I came up with it. It's the body of
evidence.
It's the body of evidence.
You totally stole that from Madonna.
Welcome to episode 101 of The Body of Evidence.
99 to go until our next milestone.
Indeed.
It'll be sooner than you think.
Yes. And thank you to everyone who sent in questions for our Ask Us Anything. We had a lot of fun recording it.
Yep.
But now we've been brought down to reality.
Indeed. Reality sucks.
And I didn't think, when we started the podcast like 9 years ago, I would not have thought that we would have to do an episode about this.
No.
Yet here we are.
Here we are, because we're talking about measles. Because measles is back.
The measles.
The measles.
Is it plural or is it singular?
Good question. I think the disease is just referred to as measles generically.
Right. I've seen. I'm going to use it the singular for this.
I forgive you.
So let's talk about measles.
Indeed.
Where does it come from?
Well, so Jonathan, I know that you have often said that we don't have enough historical digressions on this podcast.
No, I think that's one of your fever dreams. Where you imagine myself catering to your preferences.
Well, but here's the thing. I think that you will enjoy this historical digression. So I hope so. I have looked into this. And by looked into this, I mean read something on Wikipedia about the history of measles.
I see.
And it was first described by Abu Bakr al-Razi, a 9th century Persian physician.
I see.
Who, described the first written accounts of measles. However, it is unclear if the measles of the past is the same as the measles of today.
Yeah, it's something that I've seen before, like when I was writing about leprosy, where, diseases, of course, were known by manifestations. Right. They might cluster all together under one name.
Well, leprosy very famously was often confused with psoriatic arthritis. Psoriasis, right? The skin manifestations. And a lot of people who probably just had psoriasis were accused of having leprosy.
Got sent to a leper colony.
Yeah, well, and there's a very popular Greek TV show called The Island, based on a book of the same name about this leper colony and through the generations. Oh. And one of the characters was later discovered not to have ever had leprosy when they actually did a skin biopsy and found that it was psoriasis, and never caught leprosy. So he had a natural immunity to the disease. So he was one. But in the interim, he had fallen in love with somebody in the leper colony, and so he didn't want to leave. So it was a very good story, very good production. So all that to say. So
it was a reality TV show. It was a dating show on the island. People with leprosy.
No, it was a lovely. I've never read. The book was not as good as the TV show. The book was pretty good, but it's a multi-generational story of a family and how they struggle with. And then at the end, leprosy is cured, right? Because antibiotics are developed and everybody just sort of goes home and they leave the colony that has been their home for their whole life. So it's a very bittersweet.
It's very emotional.
It's a very good show, very good book. So.
But this is not an episode about leprosy. This is an episode about measles.
We could pivot. I'm fine with that.
We could digress.
So anyway, all this to say, look, the measles of today is not necessarily the measles of the past, even though it has been described. Mm-hmm. And, where does it come from? A lot of theories. It probably jumped from cattle to humans at some point in prehistory, but we're not entirely sure.
So a zoonotic disease.
Well, most diseases are, right? Most diseases come to humans. Yeah, most infections. Most infections come from animals to humans, and it's that jump that,
Could we get rid of all the animals?
We could. That would allow us to control the flu much better, right? If we just got rid of all the pigs and all the birds.
That'd be amazing.
That would be amazing. But then we would be lonely.
Now we have science, and now we know what causes measles.
Right. It's a virus.
It's a virus.
It's a virus.
And it belongs to a particular genus.
Yes. paramyxoviridae.
Exactly.
That's how you have to pronounce it. Anyways, it's a virus. I don't think people need to know much more than that. It's in the same family as mumps and the human parainfluenza virus for anybody who happens to care. But that's what it is. So it's a virus.
Okay. So we are talking about measles now because there are cases of measles out there. So if you have a master's degree in epidemiology.
I do. It has served me very well over the past 4 years.
And the study of how diseases spread within a population, those types of things. And so tell us a little bit more about the epidemiology of measles. Is it just completely gone? But no, it's not, because it's here.
It's here. And again, people who are watching the news and who are seeing the numbers and are looking at, there's 20, 30 cases, 35 cases. That doesn't seem that bad. And you are right. The total number of cases in Canada and the US right now is relatively small. But globally, especially before we had vaccines against measles, measles was disastrous. And it is still the leading cause of childhood mortality under the age of 5. And
to this day.
Worldwide. Yeah. So the global incidence of measles cases there are 39.9 million cases of measles, 777,000 deaths.
Per year,
yeah. So that is a disastrous consequence of, a disease, and the number of just when you think about the consequence that it has to human life and human suffering, that is significant.
Dead children.
Yeah.
Just to remind ourselves of the consequences of this infection.
Yeah.
Dead children.
Exactly.
Is one of the possible consequences.
Yeah.
Okay.
But here's the thing, we don't see as much of it anymore because of vaccination. So if you look at the period from 2000 to 2016, there's been an 87% reduction in annual measles cases and an 84% reduction in deaths. Okay, so that reduction is actually quite significant. And when you actually look at the numbers, because we have seen in recent years a quadrupling of the number of people who have gotten 2 doses of the measles vaccine.
Okay.
So globally, that has increased from 18 to 71%.
So a lot more people immunized against it.
Yeah, and that means that we've prevented about 2.1 million deaths over sort of the same time period.
Okay.
So it's very, very significant.
That's great. But now, of course, the COVID pandemic happened. People were stuck at home. People gave birth and they had babies, and then some of these babies just didn't get their vaccine, right?
Well, yeah, the disruption from COVID, I mean, there was a lot of factors going on here, but the disruption from COVID obviously meant that a lot of children did not get their proper immunizations. And one of the reasons why immunization rates have slipped is because of COVID, and because, people were not going to the doctor for non-urgent stuff. And because people are very sort of scheduled in their thinking, it's like, we missed this dose. By the time they went back to their doctor the next year or the year after, a lot of these catch-up vaccinations were not actually done, and that's why vaccination rates were able to slip as much as they did.
So now we're seeing outbreaks. Per the CDC in the U.S., an outbreak means over 3 cases.
Yeah, which seems small, obviously. But, I mean, if you're talking about Canada and the U.S., where there should be 0 measles cases all the time, anytime you see more than 3 cases in a contained period of time, that technically qualifies as an outbreak. So again, understandably, people are watching this in real time. They're being, these are very, very small numbers. I mean, they're used to sort of, with COVID, they were seeing like tens of thousands of people getting sick every day.
What's 3 kids
with
measles?
3 kids? Yeah, it's still significant because it means that something that is completely preventable has come back, because we did completely get rid of measles in this country.
And it's also very meaningful because of how measles is transmitted.
Right.
And we're going to be talking about N95 masks for a reason. So how is our measles transmitted?
Well, it's person to person, largely airborne spread. And, pre-COVID, it was one of the diseases where there was sort of unequivocal agreement that it was airborne spread. That and
tuberculosis, and there's a third one that I keep forgetting.
Good question. Can't think of it off the top of my head.
But yeah, those were the sort of the 2 big ones.
Yeah.
Even doctors would admit, yes, those are transmitted via aerosols, meaning that these particles linger in the air. And if you're going to go see a patient who may or may not have measles, you put on a respirator.
You put on an
because
N95.
You can get infected very, very easily. Give us more numbers on just how transmissible it is.
Well, you know how much I like math. So the numbers that was often quoted was a 90% secondary attack rate. So basically, if you are infected...
Sounds like a military term.
That's right. So if you're infected and you come into contact with 10 unvaccinated people, you will infect 9 of them. So you hear that number, that
That's
one person.
Huge.
That is huge. So you hear this number, like one person with measles can infect 9 other people. That's true. Remember, it's like the more accurate way to say, do you infect 9 out of the 10 people that you would come into contact with if they were
there
also
are 20
unvaccinated?
people.
Yeah, it's 18.
That's 18,
yeah,
et cetera, et cetera. And of course, it's unvaccinated.
It's unvaccinated. They have no degree of protection to it. So either unvaccinated or, not previously infected, right? That's the other thing that could protect you. We'll talk about protection soon.
And the virus can remain infectious in the air for up to 2 hours after an infectious person leaves.
Yeah. And again, this obviously is going to depend on
air circulation,
ventilation, air filtration. But this idea that, it will linger in the air for about 2 hours. And it's shocking that this was known and understood at the time. And maybe we'll talk about this more later, but we had a lot of trouble processing this and applying this to COVID when it became an issue. And it was in retrospect, this should have been a little bit more obvious because we knew the reality of it with measles. I think we just all assumed that, no, COVID was going to be different and behave much more like influenza, which it didn't, unfortunately.
All right. So if somebody catches measles, when are they contagious?
So the typical thing that people know, or at least used to know, because we don't really have first-hand experience with measles anymore, is the typical rash, right? The typical maculopapular red rash that people get.
Can you break this down? Maculopapular?
Maculopapular. So a macule is a flat surface. A papule is like a raised thing. So when a rash is flat but also a little bit raised, so if you were to run your finger across the rash, you would actually feel little bumps on it. We tend to use the term maculopapular to describe that. A lot of rashes are described as maculopapular.
Okay.
So you are infectious from 4 days before you get the rash to about 4 days after the rash disappears. And that's pretty important because you are going to be infectious even when you are not that symptomatic. Maybe you'll feel a little bit unwell, but you won't think you have measles, right? Because the typical rash hasn't appeared yet.
Right.
Which again sort of harkens back to the whole COVID thing. Is people are spreading this when they have no symptoms. I'm but that's one of the reasons why
pre-symptomatic.
That's one of the reasons why measles is so infectious, because you are infectious even if you're not. Hey, what's happening with my skin?
Right. So you've got measles, and then how does the disease progress in a person?
Okay, so let's go through the clinical stages of measles, because this is important for sort of understanding the reality of how things evolved, or how you have to approach this thing when you're dealing with it from the public health standpoint. So when you start out, you have the incubation stage, right? So you've been infected with the virus, but you haven't really started to have symptoms yet.
And the virus is making copies of itself inside of your cells.
Exactly. And so we go from an incubation stage to a prodrome or prodromal stage, and then to an exanthem stage. Okay, so incubation stage, probably going to last between 6 and 21 days. The average is about 13 days, okay? What's happening is the virus is going to invade the cells, usually of your respiratory tract, because it's spread by by air, right? So you're inhaling it in. So it's going to infect the cells of your airway. It's then going to spread to your bloodstream and create the first viremia. So the virus is going to be present in your blood. And you're not going to have any symptoms, or you might have very transient symptoms during this thing. Maybe you'll have a little fever or something. But then there's a second surge of the virus spreading, and that's when the symptoms appear and you get into the prodrome stage. So the first stage...
What does prodrome mean?
Prodrome is, it comes from the Greek of before the road. So it's the road leading up to the disease. So it's when you start getting sick, but you haven't developed the first symptoms yet. So a prodromal symptom, commonly used when we talk about fainting. Before you actually faint, you might feel sweaty and hot. You might have blurred vision. You might be like, I'm not feeling well.
Warning
and then
signs
the warning signs.
Okay.
So you have an incubation stage where the virus is just spreading inside of you. And then you get to a prodromal stage, which usually lasts about 2 to 4 days, but it could be up to 8 actually. And the symptoms are high fever, could be up to 40 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
For our American listeners, switch to the metric system.
Yeah, just ask Siri.
Yeah. And then you get the 3 C's. So conjunctivitis, coryza, which is the medical term for a runny nose, and cough. So, and you also feel unwell. You might not have much of an appetite because you're getting sick. But those are sort of the 3 C's are the ones that people remember, especially in medical school, if trying to write exams. So conjunctivitis, coryza, cough. So basically typical viral symptoms.
Yeah.
Okay.
But so far it looks almost like a flu.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, at the beginning stage, that's why it's called the prodromal stage.
Yeah.
It won't...
Because you don't have the rash yet.
You don't have the rash yet, right? And so if you don't know that you were exposed to someone with measles, you won't know what it is. You'd be like, oh, it's probably just a cold. Let me go about my daily business because I got to power through it and show up to work.
Let me infect everyone around me.
And then the symptoms tend to get worse and intensify until the rash appears. The only clue you might have is there is a finding that you can see inside somebody's mouth called Koplik spots. Which is going to be hard to explain to people because this is an audio-only show. But again, just Google it. You'll see the pictures. They are basically these like whitish blue-gray spots that are sort of on the inside of the mouth. And if you know what they look like, which again, many people don't, even physicians, because we really haven't seen this anymore.
Right.
They can be... They are pathognomonic, meaning that if you see them, you can really say, okay, that's very, very clearly measles. That would be the one sign that it's clinically...
It's a telltale sign.
Yeah, it would allow you to clinically say, oh, this is measles before sort of the typical rash occurs.
Okay. And then what happens? Then we get into the exanthem stage?
Yeah, the rash part. So about 2 to 4 days after the fever starts, you start to get the rash. As we said, it's a maculopapular rash. And it's, if you wanted to differentiate it from other things, another clue is that it is called blanching.
So you press it, it goes white, and then it goes red again.
Yeah, so that's one of the ways in which you can differentiate different types of rashes. When you describe them to a dermatologist who doesn't want to come into the hospital because it's 3 a.m. and they're leaving me alone... One of the things
it's a blanching erythematous maculopapular rash, sir.
Yeah. And then you're like, okay, now it's one of 5 things, right? And then
have you tried blanching your vegetables on the patient's skin?
So these are the ways in which you, because again, I mean, obviously the definitive way is you test the patient for, traces of measles. Right. But in the end...
A PCR test, I'm guessing, like to find pieces of the DNA or the RNA from the virus?
Yeah, well, you do it with a regular blood test. I mean, you also be looking for serology, too. I mean, it depends when the patient presents as well. Like the problem, too, is that patients are often sometimes present much later in the course, right? And you're like... Yeah. But then again, once they have the rash and it's a clear thing, you're like, you may not even test that at all. I mean, it really depends.
And the rash typically starts with the head, and then it moves towards the tail?
Yes, the tail, or where the tail would be if we were still bipeds. So, it then starts from the center and goes off.
To the limbs.
To the limbs, sparing the palms and the soles of the feet.
Oh, okay.
So that's another finding that would often help physicians to identify.
Some people can even get petechial hemorrhages, so pinpoint bleeding. Is it in the eyes?
Yeah, well, no, just anywhere on the skin.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can, again, the rash is not sort of a uniform thing, but it can often have little points of bleeding as well.
Okay, and then what happens?
And then, well, I mean, assuming you don't get any of the complications,
which we will get to,
you start to improve, and then you get into the recovery phase. So you will slowly start to get better. The rash will slowly start to improve. It'll actually darken, especially if you're a light-skinned person. Okay, less so if you have dark skin to begin with because your ancestry is from Africa or somewhere else. The rash will typically last for about a week and then start to fade. And then you will start to get better, although the cough may persist for about 2 weeks, unless you were to get measles, and then you would cough forever. But, the fever is probably not going to last more than a few days. If it does, then that's usually a sign that you've developed a secondary infection or a complication that is, making things worse.
So far, you've taken us through like classical measles. I guess if you haven't been vaccinated and you get measles and then you recover from it. But there are what are called clinical variants of measles.
Right. So this is something we are obviously going to see more and more of because some people at least have some immunity to measles. Like some people had maybe just 1 dose, so they have a lot, vaccine. But maybe not of the vaccine. So maybe not complete protection. So there is something called modified measles, and this is people who have pre-existing immunity. And that's either because they got at least 1 dose of the vaccine, or at some point they got treated with immunoglobulins. Remember, we can use antibody infusions as treatments for measles, so people may have gotten treated with that in some way or gotten it as prophylaxis in certain situations. or they had a prior infection, but they had a very mild case and didn't mount much of an immune response. Or you see this with babies who have not been vaccinated, obviously, because they're still babies, but they still have some of their maternal antibodies. So they have partial immunity, and so they get a milder, atypical form of a measles infection. The symptoms are the same. They're milder, and the incubation period can be longer. So you have somebody who was exposed maybe like 2 to 3 weeks ago, and they're like, only now are they starting to get sick. So a bit longer than normal. And these people do seem to be less contagious because they have some pre-existing immunity there, so they're not generating as much of a viral load with each cough or sneeze or what have you.
Can we talk about complications?
Sure.
Because, that's in anti-vax circles, you will often hear that measles is mild, it's benign, you go through it, you recover, you're fine. But that's not always the case.
No. And I think complications are a lot more common than people realize. So
complications, 30% of affected people
30%
will have
of
at least one or more complications.
They'll have at least one complication. Now, here's the thing. When we say the word complication, I don't want to give people the wrong idea to think that everybody is dying from this. You have to put this in perspective. A complication could be developing a gastrointestinal complication like diarrhea.
Right.
Which, in the developing world, probably not going to kill you, but still significant. It's not fun having diarrhea. It's not fun.
I know.
It's not fun having diarrhea. So, and diarrhea.
We've all had that experience.
And diarrhea probably is the most common complication of measles.
Okay.
Obviously not the most severe. The most deadly thing would be if you got a severe lung infection or a neurological inflammation like encephalitis, obviously.
Right.
So 30% of people, 1 in 3, are going to have some sort of complication. And again, a lot of them are going to be mild. They might just be like an ear infection, like otitis media. It's going to affect about 5%. Diarrhea is going to get like 8% or something like that. It does appear, though, that in resource limited areas where people do not have access to the same type of resources that we have here, you do see more complications as a result of that. And it's not hard to understand why, where, if you could have diarrhea, but then also develop dehydration as a consequence of it, get renal failure. So it's easy to see why these types of things can be worse in certain parts of the world. And, people who are immunocompromised obviously are going to have a worse case. And pregnant women can often have a worse course of illness as well. So you will often hear people say that, measles is mild. And it is for many, but there's a significant minority of the population that is going to have a complication, even if it's a relatively mild one.
You mentioned pulmonary complications. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Well, so it's not rare for you to get one infection and then get a secondary infection, right? So people will get measles, and then that measles infection, even though it's a generalized viral infection, will then turn into a pneumonia. And when people die of measles, it's often because they've gotten a severe infection like pneumonia. But so you can get a pneumonia, you can also get scarring in the lungs that develops into something called bronchiectasis, where the lungs are sort of chronically deformed, for lack of a better term. So there's a change in the architecture of the lungs, and that leads to long-term breathing problems, right, if the patient happens to survive. And the things causing these are not atypical agents. They could be, strep pneumonia or other types of bacterial infections that cause, typical infections of the lung. But it is there, and it is a common complication. And again, if you're in a resource-rich area where you have access to prompt antibiotics, maybe you'll be fine. But there's going to be many parts of the world where you won't.
And there's antibiotic resistance to deal with as well.
And there's antibiotic resistance to deal with as well.
And then also there are some neurologic complications that can happen with the brain and the nervous system. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because those are particularly severe.
Well, those are the severe ones, right? So if you develop encephalitis, meaning an inflammation of the brain, again, this is rare in that it's only going to affect 1 in 1,000 people. But then again, if you have 100,000 people who get infected with measles, you're going to have 100 cases of encephalitis. And these, children, adults are going to end up in hospital. When this does happen, typically happens around day 5. You get sort of standard neurological complications. So it starts off with like fever, headache, vomiting, stiff neck, your drowsiness, and then your altered mental status changes, and then you can develop 2 convulsions and you fall into a coma if it's if it progresses to that point. And even if you survive, and many children don't, but even if you do survive, you could be left with long-term neurodevelopmental deficits as a consequence because, cut yourself, your skin will heal, will regenerate. The brain, while it's not a fixed tissue, any damage to the brain is likely going to leave you with long-term consequences that may not reverse.
There are two other possible neurologic complications. Can you go over them fairly quickly?
So, we tend to sort of lump them all together. There are distinct entities. There's one called acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, ADEM. This is a demyelinating disease. So for people who remember their neuroanatomy, myelin is what coats the nerves. It's sort of like the insulation of the nerves.
Yeah.
This is a disease
like on an electrical cable.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is a demyelinating disease, what affects that, which then affects how the nerves are able to transmit electricity and information. So this is that, and it's associated with a fairly high mortality rate. A 10 to 20% mortality rate if this happens after measles. And then the other one is called subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, which again is, a panencephalitis, so inflammation of the brain diffusely.
All over,
yeah, it's progressive. It can be fatal. Again, when it happens, and it's rare, but when it happens, it can progress and cause neurological damage, if not death.
Thankfully, though, we have vaccines.
We do have vaccines.
So let's talk about the vaccine.
Okay, so before the vaccines, measles cases were, of course, very, very, very high. A lot of children got it. Again, many were fine. A significant number were not. And then we introduced one dose of the measles vaccine, and cases really, really shot down. But it really took the introduction of the second dose, which became standard in Canada in the mid-1990s, varies by country to country when it became standard. But with the introduction of 2 doses, and because vaccination rates were very, very high, we were able to essentially eliminate measles from Canada in 1998 and the US at about the same time.
Okay.
What is fascinating is that the 2 doses are not routinely given at the same time, even within Canada and even between countries.
What do you mean not given routinely at the same time?
Yeah, so usually the first dose is given at around 12 months, so usually when you're 1 year old. And the second dose, in most places in Canada, is given at 18 months, except in Ontario, British Columbia, Manitoba, and the Yukon. So 3 provinces, 1 territory, where the second dose is given at age 4.
Okay.
Just before starting school.
Interesting.
And in the US, it is largely given the same way. The second dose is given much later, just before starting school.
Is there a reasoning behind this?
So I'm sure there is a reason. I'm not sure it's a good reason. The idea was that you would give this vaccine before starting school because school was such a major center of viral spread, which again was interesting that we knew that even before COVID, and we kind of all forgot it when COVID happened.
Well, because measles causes immune forgetfulness.
Immune forgetfulness, yes. Another subject that we will come to shortly. But I think, here's the thing, vaccine schedules are fluidic things. They do change, and they're often based on the logistics of when children are going for their doctor's appointments. So the 4 to 6, I think, was routine for many people. It was like, okay, just before you start school, make sure they get all their shots. And it probably doesn't make a huge difference, except now when you have a threat of a real measles outbreak, you have all these children who are like 3-4 years old going to daycare, and all of a sudden they don't have their second dose. And parents are saying, can we get them their second dose a little bit early? And people are so hamstrung by habit that like, no, you have to wait first. Well, no, you don't. In fact, there are many parts of the world where it is given earlier, one of them being where we are here in Montreal. But it was fascinating to see that there are differences between provinces as to when the second dose was given.
So how do we know if we are immune to measles?
So we don't. You have to check. And, it's true. Your immunity to measles can wane. We do have this assumption that if you're immunized for life. And that is largely true if you got 2 doses. If you just got a single dose, I think the possibility of waning immunity is very real. When I started medical school, I had to get all my vaccine statuses checked, and I think I only had a single dose for measles, and so I had to get a second dose.
Okay.
Actually, they checked my blood for antibody levels, found that it was too low, and I got a second. I got a booster. Yeah. Well, it wasn't technically a boost. I guess it was. I mean, it's in sort of completing the actual schedule.
Right.
But anyways, that's neither here nor there. But it is a problem because a lot of people are like, well, I think I had measles, but I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. I think I got vaccinated, but I'm not sure. And I don't have that little booklet with my vaccine because, who has that anymore?
I do.
I think I have mine somewhere, but it's like
it looks
illegible.
Very dated. Yeah.
It's illegible.
Yeah.
It's illegible.
Yeah, because it was written by hand.
Yeah, and it's like a scribble.
Yeah.
So if you were born before 1970, the assumption is that you probably had measles. And even if you think you didn't, you probably didn't, don't remember. What's also fascinating is that you look up different government websites. People use different age thresholds. Some people are like, if you're born before 1980, that's fine. So the point is, if you are of a certain age, you probably had measles.
If your joints hurt,
yes,
you probably had measles.
If you are befuddled by what TikTok is and why people spend time on it, you probably had measles.
It could be a running gag of like just joke after joke after joke. But yes, if you're old, you probably had measles.
If you got 2 doses, you probably had measles.
Now, you're probably immune to measles.
You're probably immune to measles.
Yes. If you only had 1 dose of the vaccine.
If you only had 1 dose, you are in this weird gray zone. Mm-hmm. Now, prior to now, in this current outbreak, the official lines from public health were, you're probably fine.
Right.
And you have to remember, the objectives of public health are often about, you're probably fine.
Cost benefit,
right? If there's no measles, do you need to go out and get a second dose? Probably not. The only groups who were recommended to get a second dose were healthcare professionals and people who were going to travel because they were likely going to be exposed to the measles virus. But this created a big issue during the current outbreak. People were like, well, I only got 1 dose. Am I eligible to get a second one? And there was a lot of like, no, but maybe speak to your doctor. And doctors were like, well, we don't actually have these in the back room in a fridge. We have to order them. And where are we going to order them from? And is this going to be covered by Medicare? Like there was a lot of confusion for what probably shouldn't have been as complicated a subject.
The last thing I want to discuss is what do you do if somebody has measles in terms of quarantine because of how infectious they are, and then in terms of treatment?
So you have to shut them up behind a brick wall, as in the cask of Amontillado.
Of course.
For the love of God, Montresor.
Yes.
No, you have to quarantine. So if this person is hospitalized, you need airborne precautions, and that's a specific protocol in hospital. They have to be in a room with negative pressure ventilation so that the air is being sucked in from the hallway, not being pushed out, right? You have to wear an N95 mask when you go into the room to prevent the spread. So it's about isolation. If you're not that sick and you stay at home, you basically just have to stay home. And you have to stay home
Don't go to work.
Don't go to work. And so the guidelines, and again, these vary country to country, you have to start quarantining from 5 days after the exposure. Now, quite frankly, if you know you're exposed to measles, I would just quarantine from then. But you're not going to be transmissible for the first 5 days because it takes time for the virus to ramp up in your system and start producing enough virus for you to be infectious. So the official recommendations are from 5 days after exposure until day 14, right? By 2 weeks into the course, you are probably recovering and getting better. Interesting that even that number is different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some people have 14 days, some people say 21 days. But the point is, you have to be over the course of the illness. You probably should be getting better, meaning the rash is disappearing and the fever has gone down and you've recovered and you hopefully haven't had any complications.
Final word on measles?
Final word on measles. We eliminated measles. In this country, we can do it again, and we can eliminate measles globally. That is a thing because it only exists in humans. There's no animal reservoir like with influenza, right? So we can make it happen. We just need to have the political will to do it, and we have to have a high vaccination threshold of 95% because measles is so infectious. And so that's really the take-home message. The reason why people are quote-unquote freaking out over relatively small cases in Canada is that these don't have to be happening. There could be no measles in this country again if people don't let their vaccination rates slip.
It's a very Sisyphean slogan. We can do it again.
We can do it again and
we'll
again,
do it
and again
and again and again. After the break, you've heard it sponsor your favorite podcast. Do you need AG1 in your life? That's after the break. This episode of The Body of Evidence is not brought to you by AG1 and never will be. Chris, do you know what I've been doing every day for the past year?
Based on our correspondence, it's texting me dog photos from Instagram.
That and drinking AG1, just one green smoothie a day. And I know I'm getting all of my vitamins and minerals and probiotics and adaptogens. And I have to say that after shelling out over $4 Canadian a day...
Which is basically nothing.
I think I'm feeling a bit more energized. I don't know. It may just be sunk cost fallacy and confirmation bias. So if you listen to podcasts, you have undoubtedly heard ads for AG1 by Athletic Greens. That and Better Health. They seem to sponsor like 90% of the podcasts and YouTube channels out there. I wrote about AG1 for McGill at the end of March, but I thought, hey, it's a podcast sponsor. Let's also talk about it on our podcast. And I think we've received questions about that in the past. So had you heard about AG1, Chris, before I mentioned it to you?
I actually had, just because I have seen it advertised in podcasts occasionally. I mean, I listen to a lot of history podcasts that don't get sponsored by anybody.
Right.
But I have heard about it, and it's true. Like, it's like AG1, Better Help, AG1, and it's like, it's so exhausting. And again, the people who do this, I mean, I don't know how much of this is true, but they're like, oh, well, I take it and I feel so much better. And I'm like, do you actually believe that? Or is this just what you had to say to get your money?
But also, like, you can imagine how it would be easy to feel better when you think like I'm doing something for my health.
Well, these were very popular for a while, right? Like, like these people would like put stuff in a blender and make it a shake, and like, I'm healthy. Yeah. I'm drinking green smoothies.
Green goo.
And it looks and tastes disgusting, ergo it's good for you.
Yep. So AG1 is a powder. It contains 75 ingredients. You make a smoothie out of it, and it's basically, a form of health insurance for you.
Although it won't actually pay your hospital bills if you get sick.
I will point out that the good news is that it is NSF certified. So there's a recognized third-party lab that tests the powder to make sure that it contains what the label says and nothing else.
Like rat poison.
Because we had mentioned it. Yeah. Well, you guys had mentioned this on the sports science miniseries that we did. If you are going to take a supplement, and there are like a handful of supplements that have been shown to work for athletic performance, make sure that it is certified by a third-party lab, because that is not always the case with dietary supplements.
No, I mean, sometimes you go and you buy something, the label says X, and the thing contains Y.
Viagra.
Yeah, exactly, Viagra. a lot of sexual supplements have Viagra in them because... people can tell really quickly whether it works or not.
Yep, indeed.
When you're buying something for cardiovascular health, how do you know? But if it's like, people are going to quickly realize, hey, this sexual supplement is doing nothing. So you got to throw a little Viagra in there.
So I've included a list of all the ingredients in our folder, Chris, as an Excel spreadsheet so you can follow along. Because I do want to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure.
And so the first thing that you get from AG1, of course, are vitamins and minerals, some of which are well above the recommended daily values.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of these are going to be benign, especially the water-soluble vitamins, so B vitamin, C vitamins. You're probably just going to excrete them in your urine. But there are theoretical concerns with some of the fat-soluble ones, so vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E.
K.
And K, yeah. I mean, vitamin A, very famously, has been linked to an increased risk of cancer in smokers. This was the famous ATBC study, I think it was called. I can't remember the acronym. But, so there is a concern with this. Vitamin D, if you take it in very, very high doses, can cause kidney stones because it's, calcium. So you can get more calcium in your urine, and that can cause a stone. And vitamin E has been associated with more death overall, actually, and more hemorrhagic bleeding in the brain. So there have been hemorrhagic. So there are concerns to high doses of these vitamins, and that's why you see multiple reports and multiple analyses suggesting that multivitamins are not only not helpful, but potentially a little bit dangerous.
Vitamin K and clotting?
Vitamin K and clotting again. So again, most people are not going to consume enough of it, to
but they might be getting supplements from different sources.
Yes. And this happens with vitamin D, where there's like a little bit of vitamin D in this, a little bit of vitamin D in that. They think it's good for you, and they take multiple sources of vitamin D, and then they get a kidney stone.
What I find funny is that this idea of nutritional insurance, it dates back to the 1940s.
Yeah.
And the very first one-a-day multivitamin, and we are still dealing with this marketing ploy today.
Well, it's amazing how much of what we believe in terms of health are in fact marketing slogans. right? 10,000 steps a day.
Yep.
Was another one. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day.
Yep.
Pork, the other white meat.
Yep.
Some marketing. There's no scientific basis to any of that. It's just someone's like, hey, this will allow us to sell stuff.
And it worked.
Bacon as a breakfast food was a marketing campaign.
Wow.
Bacon used to be like an evening meal. And then they're like, you know what? We need to sell more of this. Let's make it breakfast food.
So yes, as you mentioned, most people do not need a multivitamin, right?
Yeah.
We also know that the people who do buy them are the ones who least need them.
Usually, yeah.
While people of a lower socioeconomic status, whose diet can be deficient in certain nutrients, they're the least likely to take them.
Also, important to point out that a lot of these vitamins are supplemented in our food, right?
Some of them, yeah.
Yeah, so, we put folic acid in our grains. We put, what's another supplementation? We supplement our orange juice with vitamin C. We supplement our dairy products and orange juice with vitamin D. Yeah.
Yeah, like soy milk.
In the soy milk now. So it's very hard to be vitamin deficient in this day and age, if you're living in North America, Europe, unless you have a very, very restrictive diet.
At $3 American a day or $4 Canadian a day, the mother of 5 who works 2 jobs is unlikely to get herself an AG1 subscription.
I think that would be prohibitively expensive.
So it becomes a thing that the worried well will invest in. So that's the part of the product that contains vitamins and minerals. But then we get into the other stuff, including adaptogens, which are very trendy. But these are herbs and mushrooms that have been quite frankly poorly studied and that were used in traditional healing practices of certain Asian peoples. They are meant to buffer you against stress with allegedly 0 side effects.
You know what else buffers you against stress?
Sleep.
That and puppies.
Puppies, yes, indeed. But a puppy is more expensive than a cup of AG1.
Especially these days. You know how much it costs to buy a puppy? Guess how much. If you wanted to go and buy a puppy today, how much is it going to cost you?
Like from a breeder?
Yeah.
Well over $2,000.
Yeah. It is nuts.
Yeah, it's very expensive.
What has happened? We've commercialized the doggos, Jonathan. This is unthinkable.
That's going to be a separate episode. But yeah, so in terms of adaptogens, AG1 contains rhodiola, eleuthero, reishi, and shiitake mushrooms. And of course, even if there was an active ingredient in them that conferred a specific benefit to human health, which has not been shown, what's the problem, Chris, with throwing whole herbs in there?
Well, first of all, you don't know how these things interact with each other. Second of all, if there's a specific ingredient that is helpful, just give people that specific ingredient. You don't have to wrap it in mushrooms. We're not dogs. We don't have to hide our medication in peanut butter, right? You can just give people the thing that makes a difference.
But also from harvest to harvest, you're going to get
different amounts, right? Not every mushroom is the same, in the same way that not every person is the same. So you're not going to get a consistent dosing, which is the reason why we mass manufacture medications, that you have a consistent dosing within a certain margin of error, right? Let's be fair. Pills are not identical, but the degree of variation is mandated to be less than a certain percentage, and we can control that, whereas with a mushroom, you don't know what you're getting.
So that you're not chewing on tree bark to get rid of a headache. AG1 also has fruit and vegetable powders.
Yeah, you know what else has fruit and vegetables? The grocery store. You can go to the grocery store and buy food.
So the argument would be that, fruits and vegetables can be expensive.
Yeah.
And so, if you pay $3 to $4 a day for AG1, there you go. You're getting all of your fruits and vegetables.
Well, yeah, but you're getting such a small amount of them, first of all. Second of all, fruits and vegetables are food, right? You drink this, you're still hungry. You still need to eat the food. So why not just eat the food directly? And you're better off investing in, for lack of a better term, real food that will fill your stomach, so that you're not then going out and eating, junk or whatever.
It also has things like, coenzyme Q10 and cocoa bean extract. What do you make of those?
So coenzyme Q10, probably less popular now than it used to be, but it was really popular for a while. Very much tied in with the whole statin cholesterol thing, as, take it either as a replacement for statins or because they decrease the side effects of statins. There's no evidence that it does anything, right? So that's just pure
speculation that's been debunked.
It's nonsense.
It's nonsense, yes.
Nonsense. Cocoa bean extract has been another very, very popular thing. There was
as an antioxidant?
Exactly, yeah. So the whole chocolate is good for you thing really stems from this. Very few studies are done on chocolate. They're done on cocoa bean extract. And there was a very large series of studies recently called the Cosmos study, and a lot of subgroups of it, Cosmos Mind, Cosmos Web. And each of these are subgroups in the main data set, and yet they're being presented as like new papers. So I've written a few...
salami slicing. And you
very much so.
You salami slice it yourself.
That's salami
You're right about it.
That's right. So if you want to go on Medscape, you can find stuff on this. Basically, trying to establish that there is some benefit to these, and frankly, my interpretation of the evidence is that there isn't. You're seeing inconsistent benefits even within different subgroups of the same patient population, and maybe improvements in some testing scores. And so they're like, oh, there was an improvement here and an improvement here. Yeah, but the improvement was on different tests and different benefits, testing different types of memory. So like, how is that even consistent? And my favorite thing is like, because Cosmos happened during the pandemic. So like, oh, we couldn't get people to come into the study, to come into the clinic. So we did it on the web. And so Cosmos Web became a different study. I'm like, it's not a different study. You're taking the same patients and evaluating them using a different method. And they sometimes evaluated the same patients different ways and counted them as different patients in the different studies. So like, you're just retaking the same patient population over and over again. These are not different studies. So anyways.
Nonsense. And also there are probiotics in AG1. It has about 7 times as many as your average probiotic yogurt, but does that mean anything?
Well, I mean, so we've talked about probiotics on the show before. It's not that they are useless. They do have some benefits, right? The main benefit to probiotics is antibiotic-associated diarrhea.
Yeah, but we don't even know what dose, which strains to prescribe.
No. So there's one other benefit to it that we mentioned on the podcast at the time, like radiation-induced diarrhea. Probiotics maybe help a little bit with that.
Which, of course, affects everybody who buys AG1. Yeah. It's such a common thing.
Most of these people are not getting, cancer therapy, radiation to their colon.
Or C. difficile infection in which they would need a stool transfer. Right?
Yeah, so again, it's not that probiotics don't do anything. It's just that they're not going to do you any good because you probably don't have diarrhea right now.
A point that I raised in my article, which I would really like to hear you on, is that in so-called alternative medicine circles, everyone is told that they can benefit from every intervention, right? Like, take AG1, it's full of stuff, it'll make you healthy. Everyone can benefit from AG1. I took the test on their website to see if I needed AG1, and I deliberately answered the questions to make me sound like as healthy as I could possibly be, and I was still recommended AG1, right? So they're shoving this in everybody's face.
I can rip a phone book in half.
But in actual medicine, Chris, what I see is the opposite, despite what you read about online. Like, doctors don't typically want to stuff you full of drugs, at least not in Canada.
No.
They don't want you on any unnecessary medication.
No.
And I find that is very interesting because in alternative medicine, it's like everyone can benefit from everything.
Yes.
Please give us money.
Yeah.
And in medicine, your doctor is just like, why are you on all these
why are you
drugs?
on all this stuff? What is this? And then he is like, I have this problem. I'm like, you're fine. Go away. Take Tylenol.
Right.
And I think a lot of people, what's interesting is that a lot of people are often a little bit scandalized by that. They're like, but I don't feel well. Give me something. Mm-hmm. I've had patients like, can you give me like a syrup or like a vitamin to feel better so I have more energy? And I'm like, get the hell out.
You're like, it's called caffeine.
It's like, well, no, but I tell people you have no heart disease. They're like, okay, so can I come back every 6 months and you can say, I'm like, no, go away. You're cured. You did not have the disease you thought you had.
And that's why AG1 exists, right? It's for the worried well.
It's for the worried well. I think a lot of people don't realize your doctor doesn't want to see you. He wants you to go away and never come back and stop bothering him because he's busy with other stuff.
But it's fascinating because the picture that has emerged online is of the doctor as the pill pusher.
Yeah.
As because we make money off of our prescriptions and we're going to stuff our patients full of pills. But in my experience as a patient of the Canadian healthcare system, the exact opposite.
No, exactly. And I think the U.S. is largely the same. I'm sure there are people who, don't practice best quality practices. And I would see with some of the older generation, they were like, oh, you have palpitations. Let me give you this medication to help. And it's not that the medication was unreasonable. It's just that you were treating patients symptomatically. Which is interesting because that's the other criticism that healthcare is like, oh, you're just treating symptoms. Like, no, I often tell people, look, what you have is not dangerous. If you can live with it, just live with it. If you want medication, I can prescribe it to lower your heart rate, but you're not going to die.
Because with dietary supplements, which are often prescribed in alternative medicine, they, legally speaking, cannot treat the disease. No. They can only, sort of say help support symptoms, stuff like that. And so it's very interesting to see how they're portraying medicine in a completely opposite way of how it actually is.
I would love it if people stopped coming to me complaining of palpitations. Like, you have no arrhythmias. You have a
You should
company.
become an AG1 distributor.
I should. Oh, my God.
Oh, there's a perfect product for you, sir. It's called AG1. Have you heard of AG1? One a day.
Yeah. I mean, listen, you could fill your day just like, doing the adult equivalent of well baby checks on people. Like, come here. Oh, let me just listen to your heart. Oh, you're good. There you go. And they would be so satisfied. They would love it. They would love the attention. which is what I think that's what a lot of people want. They want somebody to pay attention to them. And again, a generation ago, when you could just like stroll over to your village doctor and be like, "Hey, Jim, I got this like weird pain," and he'd be like, "Oh, you're fine. Don't worry about it." And now it's like, "No,
I'll see you at golf tomorrow."
I'll see you. Yeah. Again, I kind of wonder what it was like being a doctor in the 1960s. It must have been great. It must have, there were no consequences to anything you did. You didn't know what was going on, but it didn't bother you.
But you had your little black bag.
You listen to somebody's heart, you have a strong heartbeat. You'll be fine. Meanwhile, the patient's probably riddled with cancer. You had no idea.
When we come back, we've all experienced going to the clinic to see a doctor, but what is it like for the doctor to see you? Before you go blaming the doctor for seeing too many patients, Chris walks us through what it's like to see patients in the clinic and what he does and does not control. That's after the break. So, going to see a doctor at the clinic is rarely fun.
Yeah.
You're in a waiting room full of coughing patients who aren't wearing masks. The doctor is late.
Yes.
You get about 7 minutes or so with them. It's easy to blame the entire experience on the physician, which is why I thought it would be interesting for you to tell us what it's like to see patients in the clinic, like what your day is like, because most of our listeners are not doctors, we're patients, and so I think you can shine a light on why the entire process is so imperfect, starting with the clinic.
The clinic. Okay, so I will.
So you wake up at 4 a.m.
I wake up at 4. I do not. So here's the thing. I feel like I have solved a lot of these problems because now I do my own thing. I have my own clinic. It's a clinic of one. Actually, I share the space with another person.
Okay.
But I am a one-man operation.
Okay.
I rely on no one.
No receptionist.
I have a receptionist.
Okay.
Yeah, no receptionist.
I rely on no one. Yes, I have a receptionist.
Yeah. But I have a receptionist who's also very, very good.
Wow.
She understands the words that come out of my mouth.
Okay, that's a step above the average.
It really is. Like if I tell her do this, she does it.
What?
Patients call and she answers the phone.
What?
I know. It's good. Like
she's not like filing her nails like we see on TV, refusing to pick up the phone.
And we have an email address, which is like groundbreaking for many
and it is
patients.
being checked
It's
every
being checked.
day? Wow.
Yeah, like continuously. So patients are like a little bit shocked.
Tell me more about this utopia you described.
That's right. So I have created a system here that is, again, for our American listeners, they might be like, isn't that standard? Like, no, it's not. The problem with healthcare, especially with clinics, whether we're talking about in-hospital clinics or outpatient hospital clinics, you as a physician are often not in control of your own schedule.
Yeah, that's the point that I want you to bring up, because when you first told me years ago, I was like, what?
Yeah.
So you don't choose how many patients you see in a day?
No. Now I do, because I am basically on my own, and my secretary, whom I pay out of my own pocket, will now listen to me because she wants me to keep paying her. But she's also very good, and she's very organized.
Okay.
So, we have a problem. And again, not to besmirch people, not everybody who works in the hospital is good at their job. There are some people that are just not very good at organization.
Yep.
And they make mistakes, and they double book and they triple book patients. They give patients appointment on like weekends when there's nobody in the hospital. And it's like, I showed up on Sunday. Why was there nobody here? And they were like, first off, number one, why didn't you sort of raise a red flag? Like, huh? A Sunday appointment? That's very unusual. So, yeah, doctors are not in charge of their own schedules. And the reality is a lot of doctors are okay with that. They don't want to be in charge of their schedules. I am, as you may know,
an aberration.
I am an aberration. I am also a somewhat obsessive person, and I like to control my schedule. So now I can be like, no, start at this time. And I'll tell you, I start my clinic at 9:30. And they're like, oh my God, why don't you start it early?
At 8.
Like, yeah. And it's like, because, first of all, I would hit traffic if I had to make it in for 8. I go, why should I waste my time in traffic? I would rather start later and finish later. And this way, I show up on time. The problem, too, is that if you're not in charge of your schedule and your schedule starts at 8 and you only make it to work at 8:30 because something happened, right? There was snow, whatever. There was traffic. You're now a half hour behind schedule. And because your schedule is packed in without a break often, you have no flexibility in your schedule. And so if you are adding on a patient for an emergency, that's just an extra patient that's stuffed into the same amount of time. Because of the way the scheduling software works for many places, they have the schedule or the clinic is open between 8 and 12 and 15-minute blocks.
Okay.
That only gives you 4 patients per hour for 8, 9, 10, 11. So 8, 9, 10, 11, that's giving you 16 slots. What happens if there's a 17th patient that needs to be seen? They're like, well, we can't go into the afternoon because that's a different thing. We're just going to double book the patient at 9:15 a.m. So now you have 20 patients in the space allocated to 16. And double booking and triple booking patients is common because there is no flexibility built in. There's no redundancy built into the system. Like people think redundancy is the same thing as inefficiency, but no. I tell my secretary, keep the last 2 or 3 slots of the day open, so that if a patient calls, they're like, I need to see the doctor. And she's like, okay, can you come in Monday? He's like, yeah, I guess that's fine. Like they're just not prepared for this idea of getting an appointment in a timely fashion, but I keep those slots open. But in the hospital system, because your schedule is often being done by somebody you don't even know or by some sort of central booking authority, you have no control over any of it. You can tell them the days and tell them the more or less times, but also like you would probably be willing to work later, like until like 4 or 5, whatever. And they're like, no, we have to leave at 3:30 because that's when all the secretaries go home. Right. Those are the union rules. So I think the problem a lot of people have is and even when I was working in clinic, like outside the hospital, I would tell secretaries, stop double booking patients. Like, well, where do you want me to put them? I'm like, that's not your decision to make. If there's a waiting list, tell me, we'll do other clinics, but do not double and triple book patients. So this is an experience I think most people have had where they had an appointment at 4 and it's 7 and they haven't been seen yet. This happens. And it's because your appointment at 4 o'clock was more symbolic than anything else. You were just told to show up. The doctor will get to you when they get to you. And the other problem too is that a lot of patients are so complicated that you can't get through everything in 15 minutes.
Right.
So
there are cases where it's one thing, it gets dealt with very quickly, but then other patients are very complicated. They have multiple comorbidities, different diseases. They have a long list of drugs that they're on.
Well, and so now what I tell the secretary too is like when there's a new patient, give them more time because you have. And sometimes it's strange because sometimes the patient comes in, they're like, "What's your problem?" It's like, "I have chest pain." Like anything else? And they're like, no. He's like, do you want to do a stress test? And they're like, yes, please. And I'm like, done. And I'm like, oh yeah, that was fairly straightforward. But sometimes you have patients like, yeah, I have a 25-year history of heart disease. I've had 3 heart surgeries, and now my doctor's retired. Now I don't have any of my old records. We prescribe all my medications. And you're like, oh Jesus.
Oh boy.
And I'm like,
that's going to take more than 15 minutes.
That's going to take more than 15 minutes. And honestly, now I've gotten to the point where like, okay, well, we're not doing anything now. You're signing a release of information form. I'm going to get your records from the hospital because I don't have access to records, right?
Right.
So I'm like, okay, well, they come back, and they're like, so if you don't,
that's the other thing. Also, is that what is the state of access to medical records from where you are? Because a lot of patients think that it's all been centralized now. No, you can access anything and everything about them.
You can. I mean, if you're in the same hospital, everybody's probably using the same computer system. But even then, not necessarily, right? A lot of departments will have their own charting for their clinical stuff. So you may not necessarily see everything everybody else does. That's point number 1. Point number 2, most hospitals do not talk to each other.
Right.
And even in the US, like if you're like...
Most doctors don't talk to each other.
But like if you're in one hospital system, another hospital system is not going to be able to access your records with a click. They may be able to call and then somebody will send it over. And, the introduction of email has obviously... helped. The reason why fax machines still exist in healthcare, everybody laughs about that. It's because it's a non-hackable system, right? Email is considered to be non-secure.
Battlestar Galactica, baby.
Yeah, exactly. So your healthcare information is very siloed. And people are like, well, just look up my file. I'm like, what do you think do you think there's a website?
Myfile.com.
Like I think a lot of people assume that there's like the equivalent of like a dating profile with like your likes and dislikes, what you have. Like that doesn't exist.
Like a centralized database,
I can infer certain things from the medications you take, but there's no like comprehensive profile on you that is updated in real time. So people are like, what do you have? They're like, I don't know. I had something. And I'm like, okay. And again, you could make an argument, is it really necessary to know all of the details of somebody's medical history? Maybe not if you're a specialist, right? But again, I, being a more obsessive person, I'm like, well, you know what? Maybe bring me your old records. And I mean, it just drives me nuts when people with like, a 20, 30-year history of heart disease are suddenly like, my doctor retired. You're my doctor now. And I'm like... well, okay, but what are you expecting? He's like, I'm short of breath. I'm like, okay, number one, you're 80, sir. This and that. But I mean, I need to know, like, do you have heart failure or did you have... And again, sometimes I see people and I'm like, there's really nothing wrong with you. I look through the records and I'm like, why were you being seen? And a lot of it was like, come back I'll check your blood pressure, Again, maybe it's going to happen to me too. At a certain point, you start coasting towards the end of your career. Like, I'll just do blood pressure checks. That's fine.
Do you feel like 15 minutes per patient is enough on average?
No. Because here's the thing. I do all my documentation as I go. I know a lot of physicians will see patients and then do all their documentation at the end of the day. So when they say like, oh, I have an extra hour or two of paperwork at the end, it's because they're then going back and doing all their paperwork. And I think that's how things get missed. I do it in real time in front of the patient. So I'll give 20 minutes. So
you're one of those
patient.
Doctors who does not look their patients in the eye?
No, because it's pointless.
It's pointless.
I look at the computer screen.
I'm not an iridologist, ma'am.
Because the computer is where the information is.
Right.
But... The flip side to that is everything is computerized. I send out all the requisitions and prescriptions directly from the computer. There's no paper in my office,
right?
Except for blood tests. For whatever reason, you still need to give paper for blood tests.
Right.
I don't know why. But again, it allows me to complete the patient's file there, so that when I'm done my clinic, I just get up and walk out the door. There's nothing left for me to do. So I think I've solved that quality of life problem by just giving myself, again, it's not much, like an extra 5 minutes makes a difference. But that does mean if you're shaving off 5 minutes off of every encounter, that means that you can only see 20 patients in a day as opposed to 30. And when you have a government or a private healthcare company, like in the US, breathing down your neck saying you have to see 30 patients a day to meet the quota, you don't have the flexibility to run things in a more relaxed fashion.
Do you have a lunch break?
I sometimes don't, because I find it more efficient just to work through my lunch break and then just be done. I also don't always eat lunch. Sometimes I do. It depends. If I have a longer day, I will take a break. Many doctors don't. And especially if you're doing hospital work, there is no lunch break per se. You're often, and a lot of times too, is you're trying to catch up on the morning patients that are not just done yet. So the joke is that if you can finish your morning clinic before the afternoon clinic begins, you're in good shape.
Right.
But this is the problem too, is like as you delay things, it cascades down the day. So if by the afternoon patients are showing up and you're still doing the morning patients, well, there's no way you're going to finish on time. And that's why people are there until like 7, 8 o'clock.
And what are you hinted at this, but what are the main differences between working as a doctor in the Canadian healthcare system versus the American healthcare system?
Well, more money in the American healthcare system. Yeah.
Yes,
I mean, there's the obvious differences of, here in the Canadian healthcare system, everything is covered by Medicare, although that is changing. And we besmirch the American healthcare system. The truth is that if you're over 65 and covered by Medicare in the US, you're sitting pretty. Right? It's the uninsured people who are self-employed or who have inadequate insurance that becomes problematic. So the healthcare system is not, the American healthcare system is not the boogeyman we sometimes make it out to be. But the biggest difference, I think, is, access to care is harder. Things take longer in Canada. Wait times are long, but there are wait time issues in the US as well. In the grand scheme of things, there are not that many differences, but there's just more money in the US healthcare system because Americans spend more on healthcare than we do. We often don't realize Americans spend much more on healthcare than Canada does, but they don't achieve meaningfully better healthcare outcomes.
No.
So a lot of the money they spend is not necessarily well spent. And so while the Americans are talking about, cutting waste and being a little bit more efficient, we're having the other problem in Canada where we're like, no, we've got to spend more on the fundamentals because we do have issues of staffing shortages, and that's causing delays in surgeries. And when you have delays in surgeries, that again cascades, right? People keep coming back to their family doctor for the same problems. They wind up in the emergency room because they haven't fixed their underlying issues. So it becomes very problematic.
All right. Well, thank you very much about all of that. It's now time for It's Not Twitter, but It'll Do, where we plug various things because Twitter is going down the drain. So I wrote an article for the McGill Office for Science and Society about leaky gut syndrome, which I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of. So if you're interested in whether there is anything scientifically or medically accurate about this diagnosis, link in the show notes. No major media appearance to plug here from me, but a reminder that both Chris and I are on CTV Montreal News at 6 most weeks.
Yeah.
And if you can't watch it live, you can watch the video on the CTV website. It is montreal.ctvnews.ca. You click on videos at the top and you search for our names.
Yeah.
What about you?
What about me? I have a few things to plug. Also, apart from the CTV stuff, you can also get my CJAD appearances. So just go to CJAD and search for my name.
That's the radio station.
That's the radio station here in Montreal.
One of them.
One of the radio stations here in Montreal, so you can check it up there. I also do stuff for CBC on Monday mornings, but they don't always put those online. It's very sort of inconsistent.
When you're not interesting, they just don't bother putting it on the website.
They have I think they have just a limited space on. It depends if that video is going to be linked to one of their online stories or not. And the other problem is that they don't always put my name in the SEO terms, so it's not as comes up. It's very, very difficult to sort of...
You might just be like a doctor or a cardiologist says.
It's like, expert says this. So that's that. In terms of specific stuff, let me run down the list because I have my phone here. If you're going to be in the Ottawa area, and we do have some Ottawa friends and Ottawa listeners. So on Saturday, April the 13th, I'm going to be at the Indigo at the Rideau Center, so the one in downtown Ottawa, at 1 p.m. I do hope that's correct. Hold on. It's either at 11 or at 1.
He's a professional.
That's right.
Listeners. He is a professional, and he does not need a secretary. No, he's independent.
Not at all. Not at all.
He has his phone.
Let me just...
And he can't figure out when he's supposed to be there.
The problem was I'm going to go and check on the thing. It says 1
Basically,
p.m.
just camp out outside the bookstore the day before.
That's right.
There will be a long line.
Yeah.
Bring a tent.
Yes.
And then you will get to see the star that is Dr. Christopher Labos, who is still checking his phone to see at what time exactly he's supposed to be there.
Yeah, 1 p.m.
1 p.m.
1 p.m. I'm pretty sure.
80% sure.
I have two entries on my calendar. One says 11 a.m. and one says 1 p.m.
Oh, I see.
So that's the problem.
So you've double booked yourself.
I've double booked myself.
In a way.
So 1 p.m., I'm going to be joined by friend of the show, Adam, from Adam Brown.
Oh,
yeah,
I see. Okay.
He's going to swing by.
I was like, Adam. Okay.
He's going to do the reading.
The first man on earth.
That's right. He's going to do the reading. We're going to read out one of the chapters.
Okay, awesome.
Because I would have tried to convince you to come along, but I'm like, that would have been a very boring trip for you. He's going to be there, and Barry Dworkin from Ottawa is going to come and do the...
I've been on his radio show, and so have you, I think.
I will be this Sunday actually promoting the thing. So he's going to come out as well, and we're going to serve some anatomically rehearsals. So that's Ottawa. So that's Saturday, April the 13th. On April the 14th, on the Sunday, I will still be in Ottawa. I will be at the Greek Community Center at 1 p.m. So if you can't make the Saturday show, as some of our listeners may not be able to make it because they're going to be out of town, you can also come on the Sunday, April the 14th, the Greek Community Center of Ottawa. You can come. I'm going to be giving a talk. I will be giving it largely in English, so you can certainly come. I will throw in a little bit of Greek there, and there will be some Greek foods. We're going to be talking about the Mediterranean diet.
Some spinach tapoptikoks, or whatever that's called.
Spanakopita. Yes. So there's more. Stay tuned. There's more. Actually, April the 11th, if you're going to be in Laval, I'm giving a talk at the local Greek Community Center. It's going to be in a church basement at the St. Nicholas Church. So talking to the elderly... There's the elderly community group. I forget what the actual name is, but you can come out to that if you're so inclined. And then the week after that, April the 19th, which is a Friday, I'm going to be doing a book signing at the Indigo in Brossard, which is the South Shore of Montreal. So if you don't feel like fighting traffic to come into the city and you're in the South Shore, you can come there. And then April the 20th, which is the Saturday, so that is going to be the book signing at Indigo in downtown Montreal at Place Montreal Trust.
Right.
So if you didn't feel like making it out to the West Island book event but still want to come, April the 20th at 11 a.m., Ken Connors will be there. We're going to have a repeat of our West Island performance. I would have gotten you to come and do the reading with me, but you're going to be out of town. You're going to be heading to
I'm going to be in quarantine, essentially, because I'm going on vacation.
Yeah.
I really don't want to be sick. And I will be, and thanks for reminding me, because I will also be, I'm one of the speakers at the We Can Reason conference, so Western Canada Reason Conference on May the 4th. May the 4th be with you in Calgary. You can look up the details on my website, jonathanjerry.com, or you can just Google We Can Reason. You will find that. I'll be there with a bunch of fantastic speakers. It is a one-day-ish conference, so you can buy your ticket still today. So maybe I will see you there. We want to thank Graham for upping his pledge, as well as Jenny St. Martin and Robert Franklin for being a new patron, for being new patrons of the show. And remember, if you don't want your name read out on our show, Patreon is not forcing you to use your real name. You can call yourself Potato McAllister.
Yeah, anything you want.
And that's what we will read on the show.
Yeah, or anonymous. I mean, if you just put anonymous, we'll know that you don't want your name read. So we'll
know that you're William Shakespeare.
That's right.
We want to thank all of our patrons, and especially those at the $5 or more level, and they are Adrian, Alan, Barb, Bill, Brian and Terry, Christopher, Dan, Dave Lansing, David, DJA, Dominic, Don, L, Frank, Jeff, Grace, Isabel, Jean-Nicolas, Jeff, Jenny, Joanne, John, Juan, Julie, Caitlin, Carrie, Ken, Leon, Leslie, Louise, Luna, Lindsay, Maple Raisin Scoop, Marian, Mark, Mary, Mavis, Ms. Bean, Mojde, Mr. Snuffleupagus.
Yeah, I always like to hear when a Greek person
probably not their real name. Nolan, Olga, Pascal, Paul, Robin, Ronald, Rye, Sky, That Muncho God, Truman, Warren, and William. If you want to help support our show, go to bodyofevidence.ca/about, and you will see two options. You can make a donation through PayPal, or you can become a patron on Patreon, either making monthly contributions or an annual contribution.
Which actually gives you a discount if you do the annual contribution.
Does it?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, it's true. Yes.
Yeah, gives you a bit of a discount, so there you go.
When you become a patron for as little as $1 a month, you get access to a patron-only bonus podcast each month called Digressions, and this month's Digressions will be on
questions that we received from our patrons about measles, including why the media covers measles and COVID very differently.
And that's the end of our show. Theme music by Joseph Hackle. You can find him on Bandcamp as Teflon Joe. Illustrations by Luc Ouellette. To support our show, go to bodyofevidence.ca/about or find us on Patreon. Patrons of our show get a bonus episode each month called Digressions. Our website is bodyofevidence.ca. The Body of Evidence is not affiliated with the McGill Office for Science and Society and is a production of 1254-0851 Canada, Inc. And when trying to decide if a study is good or not, remember the Body of Evidence creed.
A study in mice is not a study in people.
Coincidences are easy, proving causation is hard.
Scientific studies are like movies. Some are just bad.
We can't stop at a single study. We have to look at the body of evidence.